Hello, I want to just do a video on this assignment, physical and chemical properties and changes, where you're classifying things as physical or chemical properties in the top section and then physical or chemical changes in the bottom section. So I'll just go through a few examples, like 3 examples in each section. But before we get to that, just want to review some parts of your notes that will help you with this assignment. So in class we talked about physical properties and changes in the first slide. So physical properties, these are ones that you can observe or measure, and nothing about the substance is changing in identity. So you have some examples. Physical changes are something that aren't changing the actual identity of the substance. So for example, like cutting paper, it's still paper, it's just changing in its shape. So things like that. And then also any phase change is considered a physical change. Like if an ice cube melts, it's still H2O, it's just whether it's in a solid or liquid form. So those are physical properties and changes. And then we have chemical properties and changes. These are things that, a lot of times it's talking about how it will react with something else. Chemical properties, so like its flammability or its ability to react with water. And a chemical change you can observe when you create a new substance. So anytime you make something new, that's going to be a chemical change. A lot of times people will say it's something that's like irreversible, and so it's not an easy fix to revert back to its previous state. And there's also a few clues that you can identify to look for a chemical change, things like producing a gas, or in other words, if you see bubbles. If you form a precipitate, remember that's like a solid that forms when you mix 2 solutions. Sometimes a change in temperature, or if you produce heat and light, could be a sign of a chemical change, and sometimes change in color. You need to be kind of careful with some of these and use your best judgment. For example, color change, if I color on this piece of paper, that's a color change, but that's not a chemical change, it's just a physical change. Color change would be if something just changed color on its own due to some other kind of process. Okay, so the other thing with physical properties and changes we need to think about are, we could classify physical properties as either extensive or intensive, meaning extensive that the amount of the substance determines that property. So for example, volume, mass, and energy content are all going to change depending on how much of the substance you have, while intensive properties don't change. So for example, boiling and melting points, density, and electrical conductivity. If you think about if you have a little cup of water versus a swimming pool of water, the density of that water is not going to change based on how much water you have, while its volume or mass would change. Okay, so let's look at the homework assignment. In the first section, you're distinguishing between physical and chemical properties, and then if it's physical, you'll need to circle if it's intensive. So why don't we just do the first 3, I guess. So the first one, blue color. So this is just an observation that something is blue. That would be a physical property. So we'll put a P there. Okay, so things that you can just observe without changing the substance, like its color, those are going to be physical properties. Density is another thing that you could just observe something from an object, so that would also be a physical property. The next one, though, flammability, that's its ability to react or change into something else if something burns. And so that's actually going to be a chemical property. Okay, so that's just the first 3 in that section, so you'll go through. And then the physical ones we need to think about, are they intensive or extensive? So remember, if it's intensive, we need to circle it. That means that intensive means that the property is not going to change depending on how much of it you have. So for the first one, blue color, if I have a little bit or a lot, it's still going to be blue. So that would be intensive, so I'll circle that one. The second one, that's physical, density. So remember that we actually use this as the example. If we have a little cup of water or a big swimming pool of water, if I calculate the density, it's always going to be the same. So that would also be an intensive property, and it'll just be for the physical ones. In the bottom section, you have physical and chemical changes. So again, we'll do maybe the first 3. So number 1, NaCl, table salt, dissolves in water. A little bit tricky because when you mix salt and water, it does appear to go away. It dissolves, right? So you might think that it's chemical. However, if you think about if you were to boil off the water, you would still be left with salt, meaning that the identity of the substance hasn't changed. You just made salty water. So this would actually just be a physical change because you didn't actually change the identity of the substance. You still have salt and you still have water. Number 2, silver tarnishes. Tarnishing is a chemical change because it creates a change in the color. So if you had something that's shiny and silver and then it tarnishes, it gets darker and it changes in its appearance, it's reacting with something, with like oxygen in the air, and so that would be a chemical change. And then the third one, an apple is cut. Well, remember, cutting was one of the examples on physical change. You're not actually changing the identity of the apple. You just have a smaller piece of apple. So that would just be a physical change. We can do one of the kind of bigger ones down here. Number 17 says 2 chemicals are mixed together and a gas is produced. So by just mixing 2 things, it doesn't necessarily always mean it's chemical, but the fact that when you produce a gas, you produce a new substance, that makes this one a chemical change. Okay. So those are just a few examples from the homework assignment. You also have your notes to refer to with lots of examples. So I think you'll be able to work through this no problem.